Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another workshop in the 2022 Scoping Plan Update Series. My name is Jordan Ramalingam, and I work in the Industrial Strategies Division here at CARB. During today's workshop, we'll be walking through a summary of the feedback received since the September 30th Scenario Inputs workshop. If you'd like a refresher on the draft scenario inputs discussed in that workshop, you can find it on our Scoping Plan, Meetings, and Workshops page. And as a reminder, this workshop is being recorded, and we will post the recording on our webpage. Next slide. Today, we will present an overview of the public feedback that we've received on our draft Scoping Plan scenarios to date. So as a reminder, these scenarios are for evaluation purposes and are not meant to inform any current regulatory activities at CARB. And this is an iterative process and not the only chance to inform scenario assumptions for modeling as we work toward a final scoping plan draft for next year. While the comments submitted to the docket include feedback from some environmental justice organizations, we also recognize that formal input from the Environmental Justice Advisory Committee is forthcoming. Next slide. So the number of audience members at these virtual scoping plan workshops has ranged from 400 to 800, and that's presented somewhat of a challenge for maximizing the number of stakeholders that are able to provide oral comments. So to address these concerns, we want to be transparent on how we will be managing public comments during the workshops. So we will remind commenters to unmute themselves to speak. We will have time allotted to the EJ Advisory Committee members to provide comments after presentations. During the public comment period, CARB staff will announce how many hands are raised. There will be no ceding of one's time to another commenter. We recommend that EJ Advisory Committee members use the time after the presentations rather than waiting until the general comment period, whereby they will be called on in the order virtual hands are raised. And please do not email staff directly to ask that you be unmuted. Next slide. So following the staff presentation, EJ Advisory Committee members will be invited to provide comments and ask questions. And then we will invite the other attendees. So to ask a question or make a comment, please use the raise hand function in the GoToWebinar toolbar, which should be located to the right of your screen as shown. So when staff calls on your name, please unmute yourself by clicking the red button and proceed to introduce yourself. The red arrow at the top of the toolbar will expand the control panel for additional options. Next slide. So in the first week of December, staff will provide the draft scenario inputs to the contractor to begin modeling the scenarios. The full scope of modeling, including emissions, health, and economic impacts, will take several months to complete. We plan to release the preliminary pathways modeling results, which cover the GHG emissions from the scenarios, prior to the release of the draft scoping plan. And the draft scoping plan will be released in May 2022 and will include the pathways results in addition to health and economic impacts. Next slide. Now, this is a familiar slide to many, but it's one that we've been including in all of our 2022 scoping plan workshops so far, really just to remind us of the need to redefine our scope of sources and sinks in the framework of carbon neutrality. So carbon neutrality, as a reminder, is achieved when emissions sources equal sinks. Until now, every scoping plan has focused on reducing the emissions from the sources defined in the AB 32 inventory, which focuses on fossil energy and industrial sources. We do have a separate inventory for our natural and working lands. The framework of carbon neutrality expands that scope to include all sources, which means the emissions from the natural and working lands and all sinks. Sinks can be natural and working lands, carbon capture and sequestration for large emitters, and direct air capture and permanent storage of CO2 from the atmosphere. Today, we are focused on approaches to reduce emissions from sources in the AB32 inventory. Next slide. All right, so here are the 4 draft scenarios we presented at the last workshop, September 30th, and upon which we solicited feedback. So as a reminder, 2 of them achieve carbon neutrality by 2035 and 2 by 2045. Alternative 1 phases out combustion completely. So this alternative also does not include any engineered carbon removal, either at the source or directly from the atmosphere. Alternative 2 implements a full suite of technology options, including engineered carbon removal, at a rapid pace in order to reduce emissions as much as possible by 2035. Alternative 3 uses a broad portfolio of existing and emerging fossil fuel alternatives and includes achievement of Executive Order N-79-20, eliminating internal combustion engines throughout the transportation sector as much as possible. And Alternative 4 relies on existing and some emerging technologies in line with recent agency reports. Next slide. Now, before providing a snapshot of the comments we received, just wanted to say thank you to everyone for their participation and input so far. The feedback that we're receiving from both the written comment log and through the EJ Advisory Committee is really helping us craft scenarios for the scoping plan that reflect the diversity of views for crafting a path to carbon neutrality. So I'm going to highlight some main themes and ideas presented across the comments, but I just want to recognize first, this is not meant to be a comprehensive summary of every comment, and that we are also looking forward to additional input from the EJ Advisory Committee over the next month. So following the September 30th workshop, we received 91 written comments. And in general, commenters agreed that urgent action is needed to reduce emissions over the next decade and beyond. While several commenters supported Alternative 1 for its ambition and encouraged staff to continue to improve the inputs, others argued that the assumptions were infeasible. Some commenters instead supported Alternatives 3 and 4, while noting that even the scenarios that achieve carbon neutrality by 2045 are still very ambitious. Several commenters encouraged technology inclusivity, consideration of all available alternatives, to reduce risk, reduce cost, and increase reliability. On the other hand, several commenters advocated for the exclusion of specific technologies and practices. In general, commenters supported the range of scenarios offered with a number of suggestions to refine specific assumptions. Next slide. All right, well, let's transition to feedback on individual topics. So regarding the time frame and the level of ambition for our targets, several commenters advocated for achieving deeper emissions reductions by 2030, while others argued that the SB32 target should remain at 40%. Some commenters placed a higher priority on achieving and accelerating the 2030 GHG reduction target than on achieving carbon neutrality. And others voiced support for achieving carbon neutrality by a number of different target years, including as early as 2030 or as fast as possible. Next slide. Regarding vehicle miles traveled, or VMT inputs, commenters generally supported having a range of different VMT reductions across the 4 scenarios. So several commenters requested more information about the types of actions that can reduce VMT and be incorporated into the targets listed for the scenarios. We also received feedback requesting new modeling assumptions for VMT reductions, with some calling for deeper reductions and others recommending little to no VMT per capita reductions. Next slide. In general, commenters supported the concept of transitioning to ZEVs, but they disagreed on the timing of this transition. Many commenters indicated that they believe phasing out combustion in alternative 1 is infeasible and unenforceable, with some calling for its removal from consideration altogether. At the same time, other commenters applauded the ambition of alternative 1's assumptions and advocated for the fastest possible transition to ZEVs. Commenters generally supported inclusion of hydrogen fuel cell electric technology in several transportation types, both on-road and off-road. However, other commenters argued that zero-emission options for both heavy-duty and off-road equipment are not commercially available at this time, and they advocated for continuing to use diesel or transitioning to biofuels instead. Next slide. Feedback received on biofuels was very diverse, and it reflected a range of opinions. Several commenters reiterated their support for phasing out combustion of all fuels, including biofuels, after 2035. Other commenters advocated for an increased role for combustion of biofuels in all scenarios, including alternative 1. Several commenters specifically highlighted the importance of using sustainable aviation fuel as a primary mechanism for decarbonizing the aviation sector. Several of these commenters were open to the concept of hydrogen fuel cell electric aviation in the future, but not for several decades. A number of commenters also advocated for use of renewable natural gas in heavy-duty vehicles, particularly in the near term while ZEVs ramp up, but also as a longer-term solution in transportation. Next slide. Regarding petroleum fuels, many commenters advocated for a complete phase out of in-state crude extraction and refining as soon as possible. Others set a longer time horizon to phase out these industries with the stated intention of balancing the workforce transition that would occur. These commenters still advocated for a phase out of 2035 if feasible. Some commenters also recommended against scenarios that assume carbon capture and sequestration occurs at refineries, or that refineries transition from processing crude oil to producing biofuels. Other commenters highlighted the potential economic and workforce impacts of ending in-state crude production, particularly if this phase out precedes a similar decline in petroleum demand in-state. These commenters also requested that the scenarios take into account emissions reductions taking place at refineries due to energy efficiency improvements, carbon capture and sequestration, transitioning to biofuel production, use of renewable energy, and more. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Stephanie Cotto, to continue the presentation. Stephanie.
Thanks, Jordan. Commenters both supported and opposed the inclusion of carbon capture and sequestration, or CCS, in alternatives. It was noted that a useful comparison could be made by including CCS in some alternatives and excluding CCS in other alternatives. Commenters supported application of CCS in limited circumstances, particularly associated with process emissions that are not necessarily the result of combustion. Others encouraged implementation of CCS and direct air capture, or DAC, as a cost-effective mitigation strategy that could be deployed in more sectors. Similarly to CCS, we received comments both supporting and opposing DAC. Some commenters encouraged prioritizing natural solutions over DAC. Next slide, please. Several comments were provided related to the assumptions presented to decarbonize the industrial sector. In general, there is support for dedicated hydrogen pipelines to industrial clusters. Some commenters supported limited use of hydrogen produced from renewables to support high energy applications where combustion may not be avoidable. Suggestions to develop specific targets for hydrogen capacity in various timeframes were proposed to transition to renewable hydrogen more quickly. There was general support for blending renewable natural gas and hydrogen in the pipeline, with some caveats about the need for feasibility studies to assess issues of safety and functionality. The feasibility of electrifying 100% of some industrial sectors was raised. This likely implies significantly higher electricity demand in somewhat remote geographic locations. Utilities may not be prepared to accommodate these changes. A number of commenters opposed modeling any scenario in which industry departs California. Next slide, please. Commenters recognize the importance of reducing non-combustion methane emissions as recommended by the IPCC. We received comments suggesting that all scenarios should reflect achievement of the SB 1383 organics diversion target of 75% by 2025 and the SB 1383 methane emission reduction target of 40% below 2013 levels by 2030. Commenters supported Alternative 1, which excludes all biomass resources, including methane captured from dairy digesters and landfills. We also received comments supporting inclusion of biomass from dairy digesters, wastewater treatment plants, and landfills in all scenarios. Commenters also suggested utilization of biomethane to support hydrogen production and utilization across the scenarios. Commenters reflected that while addressing global climate will likely require fewer cattle in the world, there is no realistic alternative to dairy digesters now. Others recommend consideration of sustainable, non-animal-based farming practices. We received comments supporting continued funding of dairy digesters and alternative manure management projects, and observations that consumer acceptance of enteric strategies by 2030 may not be realistic. Next slide, please. Commenters stressed the importance of reliability in assessing the feasibility of a scenario, that electric portfolios need to reliably produce and deliver clean electricity 24/7 and during all seasons of the year. And this is particularly critical as other sectors are electrified and place increased demand on the grid. In terms of timing, some commenters support an accelerated pace that would achieve 100% clean electricity by 2035, whereas others supported a longer glide path to 2045, citing that the extra years allow more flexibility to examine options to transition fossil resources, that this longer time frame considers the long lead times needed to upgrade transmission and distribution lines, and would not prohibit individual utilities from achieving the target earlier. Regarding generation technologies, some commenters support constraining eligible resources, such as excluding nuclear and combustion-based generation, including biomass. Others advocated for a more nuanced approach to bioenergy by applying environmental and socioeconomic factors to evaluate the best uses of biomass for energy. And others pointed out that constraining resource technology options is likely to challenge reliability and increase costs. So they support the broadest range of options that would include resources outlined in Attachment B of the proposed Pathways Scenario Modeling Assumptions document, as well as continuing to expand eligible resources by adding emerging and yet to be developed clean resources. Regarding the near-term 2030 greenhouse gas planning target for the electricity sector, there was both support and non-support for the 23 and 30 million metric ton options, as well as some commenters recommending alignment with the 38 million metric ton target in the CPUC's integrated resource planning proceeding. Along with reliability and technology inclusivity, commenters also stressed the importance of affordability and analyzing electric rates impacts in evaluating the feasibility of a particular scenario. Next slide, please. For buildings, commenters supported Alternative 1, which was the most aggressive option that includes achieving 80% of electric appliance sales by 2025 and 100% by 2030. Others questioned the feasibility of Alternative 1, which also entails retrofitting all existing buildings by 2035, stating electric space and water heating represents only a small fraction of current stock in California, and that it's more reasonable to assume replace on burnout in all scenarios. Commenters supported alternative 4 as providing a reasonable time to decarbonize commercial buildings, allowing for end-of-life replacement of appliances. Commenters suggested applying specific principles to building electrification that may not necessarily align with the most aggressive pathway. These principles would include affordability, removing barriers to access to clean appliances, promoting high-road jobs and workforce development, and protecting lower-income households. Regarding alternative fuels, commenters recommended that renewable natural gas and hydrogen blends not be directed towards buildings. Others suggested that those fuels be considered, particularly if point-of-sale electric appliance rollout proves to be unsuccessful. And for new construction, commenters suggested phasing in all electric appliances beginning in 2029 for commercial buildings in alternatives 2 and 3 versus starting in 2026. Next slide, please. So that concludes the staff presentation, and we're going to move to public comment. Let's see, first, the EJ Advisory Committee members will be invited to provide comments and ask questions. Then we will invite the other attendees. As a reminder, to ask a question or make a comment, please use the raise hand function in the GoToWebinar toolbar, which should be located to the right of your screen as shown. When staff calls your name, please unmute yourself by clicking the red button and proceed to introduce yourself. The red arrow at the top of the toolbar will expand the control panel for additional options. So right now I'll ask my colleague Trish Johnson if she can help facilitate comments by EJ Advisory Committee members in attendance. Trish, are there any members of the committee with their hands raised?
Hi, Stephanie. This is Trish. We do have Luis Omedo. Luis, you should be able to unmute yourself and start your comment. I hope you can. There you go.
Okay, I figured it. Yeah, thank you for the presentation. Certainly a lot. It seems a compiled list of every commenter. I have a few questions. One of the questions is, are 100% of the comments that commenters have submitted on the list? The other is, throughout the presentation, I've heard that the terms, and I was writing notes here, but the terms of some and others throughout the entire presentation, it would really help if there was a logic and a value of what some and others is calculated as. So it's 3 questions. One is 100% of the comments submitted, are they on this PowerPoint? What is the value of some and others, and what was the threshold for those comments to be able to be put on this to get into the PowerPoint? Just need a logic, just like you do in a map, you have a legend. It would be good to help me understand what some and others means. Thank you.
Sure, Luis, and this is Rajendra. I can help on the questions. So not every exact comment is reflected in the summary that staff did. We asked the staff to pick up main themes that they were seeing across the letters, things that were coming up more than once and continue to come up as themes. And we wanted to show that there was a diverse range of thoughts on the different questions that were posed and the scenarios that had been put out at the September meeting. But the links to all of the comments are on our website. And so if anybody, even yourself, want to go look at individual comments, that's all public. So that is possible. So this is a summary. In terms of some and others, it was, where did we see general groupings? Where did we see themes that were coming through? Like over and over again, we saw comments that said X, and over and over again, we saw comments that said Y. So there wasn't a numerical formula that 5 people had to say something for it to be in a some group or another group. It was, what were the themes that we saw coming up? So it is representative of the general tenor of the comments on the web page, and so, or on our website. So it is not meant to somehow group one group or a different group, because we recognized that there were letters that were both from environmental justice organizations, NGOs, individuals, and then industry and local governments, et cetera. And they all had nuances. They were all not monolithic. And so that's why we didn't try and label them. We just said some.
Okay, thank you. Well, again, just as a follow-up, it would be very helpful to have a logic and a value of how these recommendations get onto these PowerPoints, because just, if we look at it from this is prime time space right here. And so we need to know, have a logic as to how did these different strategies merit being put in here, and why others that maybe didn't reach this prime time space, what was the logic for them not arriving here? Because it seems like it's just, there's no logic to it, that we can look at it as, a measurable value. So that would be my recommendation for future meeting. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Okay, the next member of the Environmental Justice Advisory Committee is Kevin Hamilton. You can go ahead.
Hi, good morning. Could you do me a favor and put up the last slide that you had prior to this one? Great. This is just for illustration of a point that I think my colleague Luis was making. This is Kevin Hamilton, EJAC member and co-director of Central California Asthma Collaborative. So as I looked across these, and I heard the presentation, I don't want to be rude, but I'm almost feeling like, why am I listening to this? Because it's everybody's opinion. I mean, and we know, I mean, it's about as diverse as it could be. We understand that clearly. It has been for years. There's plenty of agendas here, and they're all really well described in this one slide that carries them all. So, and in the previous one where biogas and different forms of energy that would continue to be used for how long, it was basically the same thing. Are you looking at running several different scenarios? I mean, you're pretty much going to have to. I don't see how you get out of this without running like an EJAC scenario and an industry scenario, and then some sort of a blended model. And again, how do you score these? You've got to have some sort of scoring system, whether it's based on the number of people who recommend it, where the recommendations come from, some kind of a formula that you create. I don't know. You folks said you'd done this before, and I certainly believe that. I shouldn't say you said you did. You have done this before. So have you run across? So I really have two questions. Do you foresee yourself creating multiple scenarios out of the model? And then are you establishing a hierarchy for which one of these inputs gets in and which does not? Let's start there.
So Kevin, this is Rajinder. Just like we did in the last, hi. Just like we did in the last scoping plan, we are going to run a series of scenarios. It's not just going to be one that we put through the pathways modeling, and then we'll take the outputs for all of the scenarios that we run and put it into the health modeling and the cost modeling. And all of that data that comes out of that process is to help inform and evaluate the trade-offs among the scenarios, which then are part of the public discussion and that get elevated and go to the board for discussion. And so we have to do multiple scenarios because one, we need to consider all public comments, including the EJAC recommendations, including broader stakeholder comments. We also have scenarios that reflect legislative mandates and executive orders. And sometimes those may not match what industry is asking for or what the Environmental Justice Advisory Committee or EJ advocates are asking for. So we do have to run those multiple scenarios and then do the subsequent analyses to help inform the discussion, like which one is the right one for California, which one, you know, balances all the things that we were asked to balance, how do they look in terms of environmental benefits, public health benefits, costs, feasibility, all of those things that are in statute that we are required to do. And additionally, for CEQA purposes, we need alternatives. We cannot do a CEQA analysis without having a series of alternatives to do as part of that process. And so for that reason as well, we will be running multiple scenarios.
You didn't need to explain why. I assumed that you would, but I wanted to be sure. In the first one, I remember 4 to start with, and then you had to do at least one more, certainly one that we requested. So, okay. So my second question again, do you have some kind of hierarchy that you've created to determine sort of which ones get in where? Or are you looking more sector based? So if they come from this sector, they all will go in here. If they come from just the general public, then we'll run a general public one. Have you developed some kind of approach there for determining which ones go into which scenarios?
No, absolutely not. One of the things we have to make sure.
Well, you should. I wouldn't oppose that, by the way. I'm just saying it would be controversial, but it would make a lot of sense.
Yeah, I know, but we have to put forth things that look feasible and reflect legislation, right? It doesn't help to have scenarios that don't reflect existing laws and statutes. And so if we have an existing law to hit 1383 targets, we have to reflect that. We can go more than that in any scenario, but we at least have to reflect the minimum that we're doing across all the scenarios. And so there are some minimum things that are going to be universal across all the scenarios. Things like, you know, we said that this scoping plan would focus on drastically reducing or eliminating combustion of fossil fuels. All of the scenarios will reflect that, either drastically reducing the combustion of fossil fuels or eliminating fossil fuels. And so there are some general things like that that have to be universal across all the scenarios.
So just a thought, and I know time is an issue, believe me, nobody knows that better than me at this point, as you can imagine, and you. So it might be, not just might be, I think it would be valid for you to say, run the industry scenario, what the majority of industries have proposed. So say to them, okay, you know, we're going to put all your recommendations in and give them a scenario. Here's what it looks like. I'd be interested. I'm always curious, you know, that's a terrible curse, right? But, you know, how does it come out? Because maybe they need to see that if we did everything they want to do, there's no way we hit the target. There's just no way, because I look at it and I see there's no way we hit the target. It's obvious. It seems obvious. It validates the model as well. So, you know, I think you should have a worst case and a best case scenario at the very least. You know, where, yeah, we try to add as many of these things in. I understand the constraints for the final output of the different pieces of legislation and the governor's targets and executive orders. I understand that, but I'm just saying, to help the public better understand, and if you have the time that could be a useful exercise to go through. And that kind of quiets a number of voices who actually believe that, well, if you did this, it wouldn't matter anyway. You're just choosing not to because you like this, clean green pathway. So I think giving those folks that scenario and what it looks like would not be a terrible thing. I think it would be informative.
Okay, thanks
Just
for
a
that
thought.
feedback. No, I appreciate that. I'm just trying to figure out how do we put forth things that don't look completely inconsistent with existing law? And so we will take this back and think about it.
Yeah, well, I mean, you could forget about the law for a second, because we're not trying to do that. What we're trying to do is demonstrate the validity of the model. So some of those folks don't believe that the model is accurately representing. I suppose it's not really going to put it well, but they just don't believe it.
Okay.
I personally love models, and I think I understand that there's certain confidence levels that you can expect from one, and it gets better over time, and we're on the third iteration for this particular one, so we might be really close to reality at this point, as long as we use the learning that we have. So, and I've watched that with other models over the years. It seems to take about 5 years for a model to start to latch on to reality. Of course, if it's got better and better information coming in and more history. So I'm excited to see the endpoint here. I can tell you right now, I am excited. Okay.
All right. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I do not see any additional hands from Environmental Justice Advisory Committee members.
Okay, thanks, Trish. I will move into the general public comments. Currently, it looks like we have 6 folks with their hands raised. Let me just tee up the first 3. They're going to be Amy Kyle, Elliot Hoffman, and George Paradis. So let's see. Amy Kyle, I'm going to unmute you. And hopefully now you can unmute yourself and speak.
My thing is blinking saying I'm unmuted, so I hope that's true. Thank you for this opportunity to speak and to just ask. I mostly have questions. So my name is Amy Kyle, and I would like to say I support what Kevin and Louise said about tracking your proposed inputs back to the comments to see what has landed within what you're proposing to do. And maybe this is an intermediate point toward that, but I think it's just helpful then to see where different thoughts about how this should be are landing in your scenarios. But that's not really what I'm going to ask you about. I'm going to ask you about the next part of it after pathways. And I have first a logistical question, which is, my understanding is that you're going to run this whole thing from pathways through the UC Irvine thing, and then also through the modeling related to social costs. And then we get results back rather than first seeing the pathway results and then running it separately. Am I understanding that correctly, or is that wrong?
We are planning to try and do the results from the pathways model, and then also have a public discussion about the next steps and the model that will be used for the health impacts and economic impacts, so that everyone is familiar and has a chance to be familiar with those tools before we send off the results to get run through those. And so once all of that modeling for pathways is completed, there will be an opportunity to see the results. That output, which will mostly be fuel use changes, and GHG reductions, will then feed into the work at UCI and at Rhodium, and we will have a detailed conversation about the tools they will be using.
Okay, good. I hadn't heard that before, and we haven't had much conversation about that. And so since I'm here now, I'm going to just tee up for you the specific question I have about that, and that is the statewide results that you're going to get from pathways are going to be translated into geographically defined results that are at the census tract scale, if I remember correctly, at some geographic scale by UC Irvine from the health point of view with regard to PM and what you're doing, two pollutants, PM and ozone, is it? Are those the two pollutants you're doing?
So what we're going to do is take the statewide modeling and then go back, because we have the stationary and mobile sources. We know where most of that traffic and most of those sources are in the state, almost all those sources in the state. We will then go back and say, if you see reductions in fossil combustion of this proportion in these regions, what does that mean for the air quality in these regions?
Okay, right. So thank you for explaining that better than I did. But my question is you're going to do that based on the theory that the reductions per facility are the same everywhere. So if some of the things in the inventory are a particular type of source, then you're going to take that same reduction everywhere to come up with the estimates. And yet, in reality, we wouldn't expect the reductions necessarily to be the same everywhere because of the influence of the forces that lead to environmental injustice, basically. And so I'm really wondering about that. It seems like you would have to, for those modeling results to be correct, you would also then have to put in your policy construct that you're going to go with direct reductions that are the same everywhere. And I know you're not doing that, at least at this time. So I don't quite see how the results of that are going to be informative in reality. So I'm not necessarily expecting you to answer that right now, but it's something that doesn't quite track for me the way these models line up.
Yeah, I would like to actually focus on this because you bring up a good point. And the question that we've been dealing with most recently is the zero carbon grid question, which is electricity sector. And so we've had conversations about where the natural gas fleet is located throughout the state. And when we think about state level modeling, whether it was an SB 100 or whether it's the scoping plan, you can't get down to that level of which plant reacts which way, because in order for us to get down into that level, we have to think about other things like transmission access to other power if we shut off a particular gas plant. And so while we want to prioritize and make sure those reductions are in those communities, they're going to be in the design of the programs that happen subsequent to the scoping plan, a better and deeper dive into what other constraints exist that may not make that same reduction happen for those sources everywhere throughout the state. And so you are bringing up a good point, but that is also something that goes into the implementation and design of the policies to get the outcomes identified in the scoping plan. The scoping plan is not meant to design or go into that level of detail because it is economy-wide, it is long-term, and it is about the larger state of energy and fuel use and technology rollover across the state. And so I think what you're touching on, Amy, is the purpose of the scoping plan versus what does it mean for a specific community with a specific source. And there's a lot more that goes into that for a specific source behavior that is tied to the policies and programs that are going to be directed at reducing those emissions after the development of the scoping plan, but also other constraints in those regions that may exist.
And thank you for that. You explained that very well, and I appreciate that. But no, that's not it. I've gotten across my main point, but the implication I'm worried about is not what you just said. It's this though, that the way you set this up is that you have these big scenarios, and you're going to run them through the model, do the voodoo at UC Irvine, and come out with those results, and use that then to decide the health implications of the various scenarios. And what I'm saying is that even at that level, you're going to incorrectly model that because you're going to assume that it's the same everywhere. And you can't assume that that's what will really happen. And so I think you're going to be overestimating health benefits in environmental justice communities that may not actually occur unless in fact the assumptions in the model are then put into the actual policy. That's really what my concern is.
Got it. Thank you.
And then I have one other point, and that is that that's not going to get at any of the toxics issues, right?
No. To the extent that PM 2.5 is diesel PM, and we're looking at criteria pollutants, it's going to be limited in scope. And we do understand that there are toxic issues created from process emissions and other activities, and those are not part of the scoping plan.
Okay, well, I guess my final point here, and I'm sorry if I've taken up more than my share of the time, is that it raises the issue of why it may be that we should consider health to some degree in the scenarios, because this process that you're using is not necessarily going to, and I understand why you're using it. I'm not saying you shouldn't do it. I'm just saying it's not necessarily going to fairly represent actual results in especially EJ communities, and it's going to leave a bunch of stuff out that hurt the whole health question. And so it could be that we should be thinking about strategies that we know will have health improvements because they reduce activities that impact health at the outset, rather than relying solely on the results of all of this modeling to try to understand that.
Yeah, and I'll just say one more thing on this, that the base for the scoping plan is whatever is going to be necessary to meet the air quality targets and to help reduce the combustion of fossil fuels across the economy. To the extent that we have scenarios or we have modeling, it will be no less stringent than what we need to meet the air quality targets. Are there still going to be regions where there might be disproportionate air quality harm? Yes, and that's where I think the implementation and the focus of clean technology and clean fuels needs to happen. But where you start to focus implementation and where you focus the early action to make sure that those disproportionate harms are being addressed, that's not part of the design of a scoping plan. That is the next step. And so you're bringing up the right pieces. It's just what happens here versus the next steps in actually trying to implement the larger outcomes we want to see for both GHGs and air quality. Yesterday's board presentation had a list of some of the actions that the board will hear over the next couple of months that are going to deliver both air quality benefits, especially in the vulnerable communities, and GHG benefits. So those proceedings are exactly where some of this discussion is happening in that level of detail.
Okay, thank you, Amy. We have a number of commenters, so I'm going to move on to the next one. The next commenter is Elliot Hoffman. I'm going to unmute you, and you should be able to unmute yourself now. Elliot, did you want to make a comment? I think you might be.
Here we go. How's that?
Yes, I
can
can
hear
hear
me
you
now? Okay,
yes.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, hi, my name is Elliot Hoffman. I'm the CEO of a small company called Rev All in California. And I've been an advocate for small and mid-sized businesses in California for many years. Was the Small Business Person of the Year for all of California by the SBA in the early 90s. And I was personally very involved in the passage of the original AB 32 bill in 2006 by engaging and getting support from a lot of businesses. There are about 3.5 million small to mid-sized enterprises in California, defined as under 500 employees. We employ about 50% of all Californian employees. We create about 70% of all net new jobs, and we're closely tied to all of our communities. SMEs, small to mid-sized enterprises, need support and guidance to engage on our climate and emissions journey. They can't do this alone. So many do want to engage, but they don't have the resources internally to fully do this. And they generally generally speaking, have three basic questions. What can I do? Who can I go to? And where do I find the resources to work on this? So my specific suggestion is to allocate a significant bucket of funds dedicated to assisting small to mid-sized enterprises in California to engage in our state's commitment to reduce GHGs and deal with this climate emergency. By supporting and engaging SMEs to reduce GHGs, water, waste, improve energy efficiency, reducing their costs will clearly demonstrate to all of them that by engaging on this journey, SMEs and California will benefit both economically and environmentally. So again, my basic suggestion is to allocate a bucket of money specifically to assist California's small and mid-sized enterprises to get on this journey and do it quickly. I'm open to your questions or comments or whatever, but that's really what I have to say.
Thank you, Elliot, for those comments. My name is Matt Botel. I'm the Division Chief in the Industrial Strategy Division. And I'm just going to kind of follow on to some of the comments that Rajendra was making in terms of how the recommendations of the scoping plan ultimately get implemented following the scoping plan development. And you know, one of the ways in which that happens is through programs that the state pushes forward on incentives to be able to encourage and deploy greenhouse gas reduction technologies and other public health benefits. And so there will be lots of opportunities to kind of programs to small, medium-sized businesses to provide the resources, to provide the technology and the support for them to participate in the transition. And that is one of the big opportunities in terms of being able to implement the recommendations of the scoping plan and kind of leverage the process.
Okay, thank you, Elliot. So George Paradis is going to be our next commenter, but I just want to tee up that after him, it'll be Mick Skavarla, Muriel Strand, and Brian Nowicki. So, George, I'm going to unmute you now. You should be able to unmute yourself.
Okay. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
All right, great. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. And thank you, CARB, for what undoubtedly must have been pretty hard work summarizing these comments, and seems like there's every view under the sun. So thanks for your work here. I think Kevin made my point well, but it may be worth reinforcing here. I have a comment and a question. The comment is that the purpose of a modeling exercise is not to push for one particular favorable solution over another. It's not a popularity contest. A modeling or a scenario building exercise aims to investigate the relations between certain measures, factors, investigate trade-offs, figure out how far we can push things in one direction over another. And I think a good way to summarize or structure the scenarios would be, okay, what are the questions that we're trying to answer? You know, it's not a question of do I like this or do I dislike that. It's a question of what are we trying to investigate and how can the model add wisdom or granularity or answer certain questions that we may have. You know, is it absolutely necessary to do A, B, or C? How much of something else may we need? Can we get away with this or without that? So I think the underlying questions behind the modeling are what we should focus on. The question I had is, and I think you've already answered it, but it may be worth bringing it up once again to clarify it. It sounds like the final scoping plan that will be adopted will not simply be the adoption of any of the four alternatives or scenarios that are being considered. It's going to be a synthesis based on the results of these alternatives. Am I understanding that correctly? So in other words, it's less important to nail the perfect scenario here as it is to investigate interrelations between things.
So George, this is Rajendra. The four scenarios that we're looking at right now are trying to ask some of those questions, and maybe we should be clear about what those questions are. We also have significant direction and preference on things that people feel strongly about, so we do want to be responsive to those. Otherwise, those priorities by members of the EJ advocate community, the NGOs, industry and labor, they may remain uninvestigated, and we want to make sure that we're trying to be as responsive to as many asks as possible across the 4 scenarios. When it comes to the final scenario, that will reflect discussion about the 4 that we looked at, what things people think are possible, what things are most health protective, what things make sense together. And then the final scenario may not represent an exact one that we have today, but it also cannot mingle them, because if you have one that's for 2035 and for 2045, it's unclear how you mingle those together. And the governor has specific asks. He said to look at 2035 and 2045. But there will be a final scenario. It will end up pulling from these 4 in some way, shape, or form. That's what's always happened. But I get your point on asking the questions, and we can try and be clear on what each alternative is trying to, what themes it's trying to pick up. Thanks.
Understood. Many thanks, Rajinder, and thanks for the hard work.
Thank you, George. Our next commenter is Mikhail Scavarla. Mikhail, I'm going to unmute you right now. And you should be able to.
Yeah, thank you, Stephanie. I appreciate that. Mikhail Scavello with the Guelph Group here on behalf of the California Council for Environmental Economic Balance. Appreciate this opportunity, especially after a long day yesterday. I've got a couple comments and questions kind of intermixed in between. And I think, through the conversations that we've had over the last few months, I think there might be kind of a general misunderstanding of which regulations are responsive to which laws, and how we manage different pollutants across the various state entities and local air districts. And I just think we're kind of losing some of the principal goals of AB 32, SB 32, and carbon neutrality in this process, with the major focus being on the greenhouse gases as defined by the IPCC. I'm not trying to take away from the desire to see local emission reductions or anything along those lines, or reduction in toxics, just that when we aim to reduce greenhouse gases, our goals may not align with the goals of something like the state implementation plan or the local AQMP SIPs, and that we may not be able to get kind of those results from this scoping plan process, which is intended to inform adjustments and targets and other regulations like the low carbon fuel standard, which is incredibly important for our membership right now, and as well as cap and trade and renewable portfolio standard, and adjusting those targets over time and future subsequent regulatory proceedings. And I just wanted to kind of put that out there, that what the scoping plan is and what it isn't is I think being missed right now by a number of stakeholders, including folks on our side of the ledger. And to that end, I wanted to kind of urge all stakeholders and everyone that this is a time for intellectual curiosity and exploration of policies, and that we shouldn't be too wedded to scenario 1's mine and scenario 4's yours or anything along those lines. Just that we need to kind of explore the bounds of this and not foreclose on any options that may move us progressively towards our climate goals as a state. To that end, I want to urge, keeping every tool in the toolbox as we look forward, and making sure that things that are emphasized in AB 32 and SB 32 are in the forefront, such as technological feasibility. And I'll go a little further on that. Technological feasibility should include the ability to permit things and build them in the time frame that is necessary. And so to that end, I think 2035, while worth exploring, may come to the forefront that we're not able to permit things in that short timeline. I know from the capital intensive projects that our members undertake that it's 7+ years to get through the whole permitting process, and that's if we don't have a ton of challenges. If we're faced with challenges, it may take even longer. And ultimately, this next decade, in order to achieve carbon neutrality, is going to be one of infrastructure build out. So we need to ensure that technological feasibility includes the ability to build, and then cost effectiveness. CPUC's en banc earlier this year explored kind of the increasing costs and those impacts to ratepayers. We've seen a lot of stuff from Dr. Meredith Foley at Berkeley. We want to make sure that the cost effectiveness is at the forefront of this issue as we explore the scoping plan and through the model, and we understand that you guys are chasing that. But those are two key principles, and we'd like to throw a third in, and this is kind of a key principle of SB 350 and SB 100, which is reliability. I think with wildfires, drought, and the other impacts of climate change, we're seeing an increased strain on our grid's reliability. With the emphasis on electrification, we need to ensure that we also are able to maintain an adequate level of service throughout the state. And that also comes at a cost, as well as the need to substantially upgrade and create resiliency within the grid. And so that needs to be accounted for in each of these scenarios as we move forward. I think the 0.01 loss load exemption expectation, which is kind of the standard at the CPUC and CAISO, should be considered as part of this, as it wasn't necessarily modeled in the SB 100 effort. And so at this time, I'm just I don't want to kind of predetermine outcomes of each of the scenarios or pick winners. I think we want to explore both sides of things and make sure that we're going forward. And so to Kevin Hamilton's point, I just wanted to kind of extend an offer that, we'd be willing to convene, our labor and business partners, including other associations, to kind of help develop scenarios, with a little bit more nuance than we're seeing. I think there's some options that are not on the table right now that we'd like to explore, and I'll continue to reach out to staff directly, and even would extend the branch to the EJAC members on this call that we'd be willing to work with you guys and provide technical expertise and maybe some background on where we're coming from to create that understanding that I think everyone's looking for. Thanks.
Thanks for that. Are there other folks with their hands up?
Sorry about that, I was muted. Our next speaker is going to be Muriel Strand. After Muriel, it'll be Brian Nowicki, Stephen Rosenblum, and David Weisskopf. Let me... Oops. Sorry about that. Oh, did Muriel? I'm not sure if you dropped off of my... Muriel, maybe I can go back to, I think you dropped off my list. Let me go to Brian Nowicki. I'm going to unmute you now.
Hey, hi, it's Brian Nowicki, Center for Biological Diversity. Hi, Rajinder and everyone. Thank you very much for this. This is a surprisingly informative and helpful workshop. I appreciate it. Actually, many of my questions and comments have already been covered by previous questionnaires and by your answers, Rajinder. And I think I can be very short here in just saying that, like many of the previous speakers have said, looking at this very much as kind of a sensitivity analysis, as a gap analysis to show us not so, for me, and I know for the folks working in my shop, that it's not as much about making sure that we have a perfect scenario that's in there, but we are looking to the analysis as a way to point out where some of the biggest gaps are. And I know for folks who work as much on the kind of advocacy side and are looking at what kind of regulations and what kind of statutes do we need to be following up with, following these kinds of analysis, whereas ARB needs to deal with the laws as they currently are laid out. And I completely understand why they need to ultimately have one coherent scenario. For many of us who are working on the individual pieces of this, very much look into the analysis to be able to say, in this sector, here's how many tons we're still leaving on the table, and here's some of the potential options, or the potential for reducing those emissions in that sector. So to the extent that we can have in the analysis report that we'll be seeing before May, as much as we can see that by sector, so that I don't have to look at the entire. Let's say I have a PET scenario in alternative one, and but to be able to look at the total numbers on that are probably not as important as being able to see by sector what were the options that came out ahead, where were there just intractable problems where we were not able to get the kind of reductions in those sectors that made, for example, alternative one infeasible. So this has been how the analysis has been trending over the past couple of updates, and so I'm sure that this is already in your thinking. Just want to remind you here and express that it has been very helpful for ARB to kind of spend some time teasing apart at the sector and actual measure level how the various alternatives have compared. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Brian.
Thanks, Brian. So Muriel, I see you now. I'm going to unmute you and you can make your comment. Muriel, are you there? Okay, I'm not sure. I think she's dropped off again. So let's see.
You hear me now?
Oh, yes. Go ahead.
Oh, okay, I was clicking the wrong button. This is very confusing. Okay, so my name is Muriel Strand, and I am a retired air resources engineer. And looking at the workshop materials for today, it appears I didn't see any deadline for further comments. So I'm suspecting that will you be taking further written comments?
So Muriel, this is Rajinder. You are certainly welcome to send any comments and feedback after this workshop. We are working towards meeting with the Environmental Justice Advisory Committee over the next few weeks, and then also trying to come up with final draft scenarios to send to the modelers by the beginning of December. So we continue to take in comments, but the sooner we get them, the better chance we have of actually considering them as we're trying to nail down the scenarios.
Okay, thank you, Muriel. So our next commenter is going to be Stephen Rosenblum. I'm going to unmute you right now. And you can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity to speak. I really appreciate the hard work that CARB is doing on this issue. And I just wanted to make a comment. I'm looking forward to the results of the scenarios. I think as one of the EJ committee members pointed out, it's really important to find out what the expected results of the different models are going to be, because we're facing a climate emergency. And we can't afford to make wrong decisions now, which will lead to failure, because we all know that we're facing climate disasters, wildfire, drought, and we can't afford to go down a path that doesn't lead to success. I know we're, as a state, only 5% or 10% of or less of global warming gases, but we have to show leadership, which California has always done on environmental issues. And I think just looking down the path to after the results, I think we have to understand that we're in an emergency now. It's not a question of deciding if we're going to build a bike path, what the scope of the path is going to look like and where it's going to go and whose business is going to be impacted. We have to think more like we're fighting a wildfire. We can't talk about things like economic viability or cost effectiveness. We have to look at it like we're fighting a wildfire, and we have to throw everything we can into it that we have. And people shouldn't be looking at scenarios that allow a lot of time and lead to failure. So I just want to encourage, looking down the road to the end of the studies, that we really need to be aggressive. So I appreciate your work, and thank you again.
Thank you, and I feel compelled to share the statistic on California's GHG emissions relative to global emissions. It's less than 1%. I know you said 5 or 10, but I want to make sure that we are putting out the correct facts here at ARB. The point is well taken that it is a climate emergency and we need to throw all tools on the table at it. I think the construct in which we have to work needs to be recognized. We have statutory direction from the legislature about what we need to consider in any of the development of the scoping plan. And so we are mandated in statute to look at things like technologically feasible, public health improvements, cost effectiveness, impacts to the economy. And so I think in order to start having more of those tangible conversations, getting some preliminary modeling on some of the different options that we have is important. But there are constraints under which we as ARB staff will be working, because we have to be in compliance and responsive to the statutes that are in place. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. So our next 3 commenters are going to be David Weiskopf, Helen Walter Terranoni, and Joanna Gubman. I'm going to unmute David right now. Oops, and you should be able to unmute yourself. David, are you able to unmute yourself?
I'm just now able to unmute myself. Thank you very much. Just a quick question. I think this has all been very helpful. I'm curious to know on the inputs, if it's possible, or to what extent you'll be able to disaggregate where inputs reflect current policy and law, and where assumptions represent policy gaps. So, for example, if or even executive order goals. So, if we say we would model new vehicle sales to be zero emission by 2035, but we don't currently have a policy on the books for removing existing combustion vehicles from the road. Will those types of gaps be identified in the various scenario outputs?
So it's not scenarios is where we would be looking at that. What we would be saying is, here's the outcomes we need to achieve on transition to clean fuels and clean technologies. And in order to achieve those outcomes, we need to deal with the current fuels that are out there and the current technologies out there. So if we are going to be more aggressive on deploying electric vehicles, and there's still a certain amount of combustion vehicles on the road, we are going to have to say in the scoping plan, do we take those vehicles off the road with some kind of cash for ICE program, so cash for internal combustion engines, or do we let those vehicles persist until the end of life, and then your only choice is to buy an electric vehicle? So we will have that discussion, but the scoping plan is not going to reflect what the current laws and regulations are. It's going to show where we ultimately need to be. There's a lot that's going to our board. There's a lot that's going to agencies, and what we do is, after the scoping plan is done, measure what the current policies and outcomes are meant to be in those policies, and are they putting us on that track that we identified in the scoping plan or not.
Thank you. So our next commenter is Helen Walter Terranoni. Helen, I'm going to unmute you right now, and then you can unmute yourself.
Thank you very much. My name is Helen Walter Terranoni from the Air Conditioning, Heating, and Refrigeration Institute. And I just want to tell all the CARB staff, thank you very much for all your your very hard work on this effort. I know that building models is not easy, and balancing stakeholder input's not easy. We provided some comments with some recommendations around modeling, as well as some questions around some various potential options. We would be happy to, as Mick had noted earlier, Mick Scavello had noted earlier, we'd be happy to have a conversation with you, or maybe kind of help you, point you to some data sources if that might be helpful. We also have some thoughts around, specifically around the HFC questions. We have done a lot of work in that arena, and maybe have some ideas around the installed base and reducing emissions there. We don't have a particular policy position around the options, so that's not, but we did want to make sure that you have the best information in hand to move forward. I do have a question around maybe access to the modeling work that's been done already, or access to the modeling work that will be done in the future, to be able to provide additional and better input as you go through this work. Do you plan to set up, a website or some kind of a review process, or something for folks to kind of have a look or provide you with additional information?
So we are able to take any information you want to provide right now, just as we did in the last scoping plan. We will have detailed information about the assumptions that we use and the data sets that we rely on inputs. So if there's something that you feel is vital for us to consider or look at, please send it to us, and we will make sure that we consider it as we go into the modeling. No modeling has been done for the scoping plan. I want to be clear on that point.
Okay.
We've not done any modeling to date.
Great, thank you very much. We will reach out with some information, and it may be helpful to set up an offline call to kind of walk through some of that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Helen. Our next commenter is Joanna Gubman, and Joanna, I'm going to unmute you, and after Joanna, it'll be Leah Lewis Prescott, Dan Sakaguchi, and Emily Turkle. So, Joanna, let me unmute you right now. It looks like, Joanna, are you able to unmute yourself? Okay, let's, maybe we can circle back with Joanna. Let's move to, let's see. I'm going to unmute Leah Lewis Prescott. And Leah, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Hi, could you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Great, thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to comment. My name is Leah Lewis Prescott, and I work in the Oakland office of RMI. Thank you to staff for all of your hard work. This is really incredible, and really grateful for all of the time you've put in and incorporating all of the different opinions and perspectives. It's really impressive. I'd like to comment briefly on building decarbonization. Buildings account for 10% of our state greenhouse gas emissions and also contribute health-harming nitrogen oxides and particulate matter. We need to reduce these building emissions, and I thank you for including electrification as the solution to decarbonize our building sector in the scoping plan. Given the health, air quality, and climate benefits of electrification, California should set a future date to phase out existing fossil fuel appliances upon burnout. And in the time leading up to that phase out date, the state should coordinate a plan to ensure an equitable transition that includes but is not limited to funding for low-income residents, protections for tenants, and creation of high-road jobs. The implementation of this coordinated strategy should be achieved through an inclusive process in close partnership with impacted communities and other stakeholders. I hope that this scoping plan is on that path and recognizes this imperative to equitably electrify California's buildings. And I hope that the final product helps to drive the necessary state coordination to transition to clean and healthy buildings. Thank you again for the opportunity to comment, and thank you so much for all of your work on this effort.
Thank you, Leah. Our next comment, we'll try Joanna Gubman, and Joanna, I've unmuted you. Hopefully you can.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Oh, great. Sorry, I was having trouble unmuting before. My name is Joanna Gubman. I'm with Urban Environmentalist, and thank you to all of the staff at the Air Resources Board. I know modeling is very hard. I just wanted to comment on a few things. First of all, just apart from any of the specific scenarios or alternatives that you're looking at, it seems like a number of things are just sort of not considered and are off the table, which is of concern to us. So Urban Environmentalist is interested in the intersection of land use and climate and environmentalism. And it seems that the modeling is very focused on technology substitution, which is essential, but essentially doesn't look at the impacts of land use choices, whether that's relating to vehicle miles traveled or related to housing and the resulting emissions from buildings. I know that sometimes these things are hard to fit into models, but that doesn't mean they can't be considered exogenously to the model. We, in our comments, offered some ways of thinking about that, but if what we're doing with land use results in people moving to Phoenix, that is a huge carbon leakage and something that we should be thinking about. Conversely, if we can build compact urban forms, that's a huge saving. I also wanted to note that there's a lot of focus on, again, substitution of vehicle type, but not on mode shift, which is also essential. So we'd love to see more nuanced look at VMT. I understand, I was listening to one of the other workshops, and somebody on staff said that a lot of land use choices are considered at the local level, and I wanted to note that that is not entirely a complete picture. The CTC, Transportation Commission, TELSA give out vast amounts, billions of dollars in funding that go towards land use, and in the RENA process, HCD allocates where new housing will be built. So there are levers for the state that it should be considering in climate planning, and not just considering, but using. And then finally, there's certain types of vehicles that are not considered at all, like micromobility, or even just walking. So micromobility is a real type of transportation. If a vehicle has 1/100th the weight of a car, it has approximately the same amount of climate benefit. And so these are things that I hope the model will think about, if not endogenously, then at least after the fact, trying to find a way to consider these measures or approaches towards reducing our emissions, because if we don't include these types of measures in the scoping plan update, then all of the decision making down the line will not be considering those options as serious climate measures that should be undertaken. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Joanna. It's Matt Botel again. I just want to say appreciate the comments. A couple of responses real quick. So in the scenario assumptions and the different alternatives that we're looking to evaluate, one of the key inputs is a percentage of VMT reductions that we should expect into California under the different timeframes that we have for carbon neutrality. And part of coming up with an estimate of the potential VMT reductions and implementing the scoping plan, will be looking at those strategies around things that ultimately reduce fossil fuel consumption, like walking, biking, micromobility, and connections between transit, housing, and transportation infrastructure. So that is part of the broader scoping plan process, but I think it's important to also recognize that the the scoping plan is looking at energy and fuel use and technology, and so it's more comprehensive than just looking at something like land use. The strategies to implement VMT reductions, to get those fuel use reductions that come from things like transit-oriented development and transit and micromobility, those are going to be part of implementing the ultimate outcomes of the scoping plan. And then the final point I'll make is that we are looking to, at some point here in the near future, do some additional deep dives in a workshop on transportation, which will obviously look at VMT, and that will be done in partnership with our state agencies. So more to come on that topic.
Okay, thank you, Joanna. We have about 9 more folks with their hands raised. The next is going to be Dan Sakaguchi, and after Dan, it'll be Emily Turkle and Eric Barnes. So Dan, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you, and you should be able to speak.
Great, thanks. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Perfect. All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Dan Sakaguchi. I'm a researcher of Communities for a Better Environment. Also want to echo everything that's been said before, appreciating all the work by CARB staff to put in this workshop today. And I apologize if this isn't asked before, but I had a question that I'm really hoping makes sense about pathways input assumptions that haven't been named yet or put out in the public. My understanding of how pathways works is that it relies on a wide range of inputs that extend beyond the list that has been put out for the draft assumptions, and that those other inputs that haven't been listed can really have a large impact on the end results. Just to give one really tangible example, my understanding is that the use of biofuels that is projected in the model is tightly constrained by how much biomass is assumed to be available. And that depends on whether in-state or out-of-state purpose-grown, for example, resources are used. And that this can affect the type of biofuels that are produced, how much, and then ultimately, and the thing I'm most interested in is the extent of those impacts on workers and EJ communities. And so those assumptions about biomass availability seem really essential, and I haven't seen those in the draft assumptions put out. So the general question, I guess, is what those input assumptions will look like for those that aren't in those scenario inputs that have been put up for comment. And I guess I'm wondering whether or not those are going to follow the assumptions that were used in E3's Achieving Carbon Neutrality study. Thanks.
Thanks for that question. And I want to flag that right now the questions that we're trying to put up are the bigger questions in the modeling. Like, do we even consider biofuels or not as one of the fuels to consider in the scoping plan? If we have a scenario that includes biofuels, we have different sources of information. We have the billion-ton study. We have work that's underway using the biofuel supply model that we had last time. And all of that information, whatever we rely on, will be made public. You're right, there are going to be some constraints on it. There's also sources of biomass-derived fuels. And what do we do with that biomass that's going to be sitting out there? Do we let it decompose? What do we do with it, including wildfire management? And so, yes, we're going to put that information out there, but still we need to understand the demand for some of that fuel. And many of the questions that we have are speaking to demand as well as threshold, or should we even consider that fuel for those end uses? Matt, do you want to speak any further on the biomass question and supply?
No, I think that's pretty much all of it. Maybe just one other piece here is that, as Regina mentioned, we are planning to make that information available. You're right that there is some biofuels, so kind of supply inputs that we need to look at as part of the modeling work. And then one piece is also the connection to our natural working lands work that we are undertaking right now, which will also look at how the different land management strategies we have for instance, for our state forests and for ag lands could result in potential biomass availability. And so this is a connection point between the scoping plan sectors that we are working on.
Okay, thank you. Our next commenter is Emily Turkle. Emily, I'm going to unmute you and you should be able to speak.
Thank you. Am I audible?
Yes.
All right, great. Thank you so much to Jordan, Stephanie, Rajinder, and Matt for your time and expertise today. as well as to the EJAC members for all the valuable contributions. I'm Emily Turkel from Calpine, and I just had 2 points of clarification. So firstly, does CARB's use of the phrase engineered carbon removal always refer to both CCS and technologies that address legacy emissions such as direct air capture? Many of the public comments didn't necessarily emphasize the distinction. And additionally, will different scenarios include different definitions of carbon-free electricity? And will a list of the current tentative resources be included in the alternatives be made available by next week's workshop? Thanks.
Hi, there are a couple questions there, so I'm going to try and go through each of those. For the zero carbon electricity, we are trying to align with the SB 100 report on what counts as a zero emission resource as much as possible, and that's why in the document that was posted for the 30th workshop, you will have seen an attachment B, a list of resources. If those need to be expanded, please make comments on that. In terms of engineered carbon removal, that refers to anything that is not natural working lands. So it could be carbon capture sequestration, carbon capture utilization, direct air capture. And so it's not just about how to handle emissions that are ongoing, but also thinking about emissions that are already persisting in the atmosphere and may need to be addressed. Because when we put the natural working lands piece and the industrial and energy side together, we may still have emissions that are persisting that need to be dealt with through things like direct air capture. That's unclear right now because we haven't done the modeling. We need to do the modeling. But yes, all of that fits together that way. I think I got all your questions. Did I miss anything?
It sounds like
muted there for a moment. Thank you, Rajinder. Yes, I just wanted to clarify on the engineered carbon removal point because the DOE and the UN operate under different definitions than CARB is currently operating under. So that was it. But thank you so much.
Okay, welcome.
Thank you. So Eric Barnes is our next commenter.
Hi, this is Eric Barnes from Motorcycle Industry Council. I think the comments that were made relating to the importance of considering impact to industry, feasibility, things like that are very important to keep in mind. The options, alternatives that you're looking at are very aggressive. But I did have a question with option number 1, and in eliminating combustion, you included hydrogen in that. And if we're thinking about carbon neutrality and GHG, I understand hydrogen is sourced from fossil fuels, but that's not necessarily the only source of hydrogen. So why would you include hydrogen if there are potentially other sources?
So I can jump in and take that one. So the scenarios are draft right now. We know that based on public comments and the recommendations from the Environmental Justice Advisory Committee, we will make some modifications and we may, redesign a couple of the scenarios based on those comments. I think what you're asking for is a more nuanced approach in alternative 1 to recognize that some hydrogen may be usable in that alternative. So we will take that comment back. Thank you.
Okay, our next commenter will be William Barrett, and after William, it'll be Gerald Cawthon and Robert Jackson. Okay, William, I'm going to unmute you, and I think you should be able to unmute yourself.
Great, thank you so much. This is Will Barrett with the American Lung Association. Thank you, Rajinder, for all your hard work on this. I hope you're hanging in there. I know it's a big lift. Really do appreciate the dialogue that's gone on today and previously, and really I think the presentation really highlights the challenge, right, of the diversity of perspectives and the lenses that the stakeholders are all looking through when we look at the scoping plan. We heard from, for example, SEEB noting, the priority for cost effectiveness. We're coming at this and looking at it from community health and direct emission reductions as our key priorities. Definitely, appreciate you have a big lift and a lot of stakeholders trying to provide their input. The thing I wanted to just note briefly is the Lung Association, a bunch of our health partners put in a letter recently really tracking with comments you heard earlier from Kevin Hamilton, Amy Kyle, and others, really just wanting to raise some of the questions on where we think the health evaluation can be most useful, and really answering these questions like, are we leaving benefits on the table? Are we creating new problems by relying on one policy over others in terms of community health? We want to kind of just flag the importance of knowing where certain measures might interact to impact health, either positively or negatively, and want to see that kind of borne out in the health evaluation. Just give as fine a point on some of these questions we issued in our letter, and you've heard others talk about today. Really want to also encourage the interaction with the State Department of Public Health, Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment in this process, and really, I think, as my understanding is, there'll be a workshop on the health evaluation coming up in a month or so, and I think during that it would be helpful to hear from some of the CARB sister public health agencies in the process, and just the inclusion of those other agencies would be helpful. And then would also be interested, or just really want to note in closing, just that I think some of the comments you've heard about this gap in identification, I think Dave Weisskopf and Brian Nowicki both kind of spoke to this, really where we can identify where the policies are now, where we need them to fulfill the promise of those policies, where we need additional work, investment, legislation, those kind of things. I think that's all helpful to stakeholders to kind of get a sense of where these gaps are, and what the potential is for improving health and protecting against any negative consequences that might arise through the interaction of all of these different scenarios and strategies. So that's all. I just really appreciate the opportunity to say a few words, and appreciate all the work that's gone in on this so far.
Thanks, Will. I just want to flag a couple of things there. First is, we haven't really been able to do something substantive on the health piece because we don't have any data to start working with, and we don't have the scenarios nailed down to be able to start saying, okay, what does this scenario actually imply? What did the outcome actually imply? So we're kind of waiting to get that first step addressed so that we can then start piecing together the story on the public health side. And we can do something that's non-quantitative on the public health side without the modeling. Obviously, status quo, no change, means that we're going to rely on fossil fuel combustion, et cetera. Over the scenarios, what you see is how quickly, how much do you rapidly get out of fossil fuel combustion? I mean, that's really the public health story in the scoping plan, is how fast and to what extent do you get off of fossil fuel combustion? And so there's a gradation there. But yes, we are going to be having a workshop under the scoping plan for public health. We'll probably have more than one workshop because we want to start talking about some of the work that ARB is doing in particular, in terms of new health endpoints and new kinds of analyses that we have. And we would also want to bring in our contractor UCI to dig in more on the model and the limitations or benefits of using the models that they have and hear those concerns. But I think we're a bit further away from having a full public health discussion on the scoping plan, because we're just starting in terms of what things do we want to see happen and how quickly do we want them to happen. But more to come on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next commenter is Gerald Cawthon. Gerald, I'm going to unmute you, and you should be able to speak now.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, my name is Gerald Cawthon. I am the president of the Bay Area Transportation Working Group, and we are in operation to try to improve transit's ability to attract more people out of their cars. I just want to cover a little bit about results, because this discussion, which is very learned, is all about process. And so the United States has done extremely well in the last 20 years. We've been focused on it, heavily focused on reducing greenhouse gases for over 20 years. And I would give credit for that to several. I'm only talking about transportation. I mean, there's all kinds of improvements in building insulation, many other things, but in transportation, the Obama administration set up some higher emission control standards which affected the automobile industry. The automobile industry actually stood up and greatly improved the efficiency of its engines. Mileages, as we all know, are much higher now from new cars than they used to be. And the electric vehicle industry is also accelerated, and I give credit for that too, because that's another important improvement. Now, what's left? Well, what's left is VMT. And the pandemic has, among its many horrible attributes, has had one improvement, which is it has reduced VMT, but that's not the reason. That's not why we want VMT to be reduced, not because of a pandemic. So the question is, and incidentally, the use of highways and roadways has rapidly begun to climb right back up to where it was before COVID. So what is going on the ground, not in the offices, but actually on the ground to reduce VMT, which still accounts for something like 40, or automobile and truck use accounts for something like 45% of all greenhouse gases. This is not inconsequential. I would say that the responsibility for that lies with Caltrans, with the counties, with the regional governments, with local governments, and with CARB. And again, I'm talking about results on the ground after 20 years, not more study that doesn't lead anywhere. And I want to end by saying a couple of things about two of the very often cited improvements that have actually been talked about today and have been talked about many times. While I'm a big favorite of electric cars, we have to remember that all those cars that are going to be presumably sold to make room for the electric cars, where do they go? Are they going to all be scrapped? Not likely. Most of the time, they're going to be sold on the used car market and either continue to drive in this country or be shipped to other countries that can drive those cars. So electric cars, without some other steps, aren't going to be all that effective. And one last thing, transit-oriented development is something we've studied a lot because it sounds great, but the truth is it only affects mostly commuters. If you're commuting to your job and you're living near a major transit line, you might very well switch to that. But transit commuting today is something like 4% of total trips. That means that over 95% of trips are not transit commute trips. So what about all those other trips? Wait a minute, let me get rid of this. Sorry. There. What about all those other trips? If you're a mother or a father taking your child across town to the nursery school, or your kid to a volleyball game, or you're going to make 10 errands all at once, you're not going to spend all day on a bus or on a train getting there and back. So we have to be careful not to take the simplistic solutions or simplistic ideas and think of them as solutions. It's going to take a lot of work and all-out effort. I give you credit for what you're trying to do, but I really think the results should be more of the discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, hi, thank you, Gerald. I'm just gonna touch on a couple of points here. So in terms of results, I mean, what we're trying to do obviously is build a set of scenarios that we can model to be able to look at what the energy use, what the greenhouse gas emissions are, and eventually what the public health and economic benefits of our various decarbonization strategies. And so we need to get there in terms of being able to model those results. We need to be able to develop the scenarios for part of the scoping plan. More pointedly on some of the issues you raised, on VMT and on transportation strategies. We have recognized, our agency has recognized that our transportation emissions are a major source of both greenhouse gas emissions and air pollution here in California. That comes from both light duty, medium, and heavy duty combustion, and there are many strategies to get at those emissions that we need to make progress on, whether it's technology turnover or it's advancing more energy efficiency or VMT reductions to ultimately get additional reductions. But it's a complicated problem. There are lots of agencies, as you've pointed out, that are working on this, both local, regional, and state and federal, that are all involved in various different transportation planning, funding, and implementation decisions that affect how people move about the state. So we're not blind to the issues, but I acknowledge that there's a lot that needs to be done in that sector. And so what we want to do in the scoping plan is provide a pathway for transportation that talks about how we're going to reduce emissions, both through technology turnover and through transportation strategies. And then we have to look to our partners in this space to actually implement some of those measures that are going to get us those reductions. And it's going to be a mix of strategies. It's not going to be an all-in on just one. I think Virginia, I see she has her camera on, so assuming she wants to add a few pieces there.
Yeah, I just want CARB to be on the side of facts here. And yes, the Obama administration did work towards efficiency standards that we supported, but the administration, when it turned over, fought us on our authority under the waiver to set those standards and for other states to follow us. And we are now re-engaging on a different set of standards that could be the national standards. And so there is a lot that can be done on efficiency. And we have to think not just about light duty, we also have to think about medium and heavy duty, locomotives, marine, and aviation, because there are significant sources of diesel PM and significant amounts of communities that live near rail yards and ports and freeways. And so there is a public health issue that also needs to be considered along with that technology, along with that VMT. And so I don't think that VMT is the only or the primary solution to the transportation sector. I still believe, and I think many of us do, that there's a lot that can be done on the technology side across all of those fleet types. Thanks.
Okay, we have 4 more commenters currently left. They will be Robert Jackson, Nico Beaucamp, Edward Phillips, and Robert Spiegel. So Robert Jackson, I'm going to unmute you right now and you can speak. Or you should be able to unmute yourself. I think you might have to unmute yourself, Robert.
No, but there we go.
Yes, we can hear you.
It would not click. Sorry about that. Hey, this is a new thing for me. I've lived as an organic farmer under the watchful eye increasingly of CARB, and it has been our goal to have clean air. But I've spanned the time span from when I was a little kid. When we used to burn our wheat stubble here in California, and we couldn't see our mountains in the early 70s here in the San Joaquin Valley, and I've seen a lot of progress growing up, and so I'm proud of what we're doing as a state to try to clean up our air and then reduce our emissions, reduce our greenhouse gases. Last couple of years, I'm representing also an industry. From the industry side, we foresee, and from the biomass industry side, we foresee that any long-term solutions fighting this critical fight right now regarding greenhouse gases, any long-term solutions need to be economically feasible and sustainable, because that was just responding to one of my friends or one of the folks here commenting today. If we take our eye off of sustainability and economic, which includes economic sustainability, we won't win the fight in the long run. And so we believe that you know, this whole biomass issue, and I know that it's a big issue and it's been looked negatively on in the past because primarily of what it could, because we combust it in the past, and it could also incentivize poor forest management. But one of my partners in our company comes from the forest management industry, where his whole livelihood has been involved in replanting burn forest, cleaning out burn forest, and really, you know, restoring the ecosystems back in the forest. And then, of course, on the farm side, we come from the background of actually burning our biomass, and so we really feel like if to find a long-term solution for that is immediately available to our state. Biomass converted to hydrogen is one of our best sources of renewable hydrogen. We can produce it with significant negative carbon numbers in the triple digits, so that we actually are a carbon sink. One thing that we would ask, though, for CARB to consider in our long-term strategy is we really feel like the state should have part of our strategy for reducing greenhouse emissions should focus on hydrogen, but also on hydrogen carriers that are non-toxic, non-flammable, that are recyclable, and that do not take any energy to release the hydrogen from, because it is the most abundant and most concentrated form of energy, but it's the hardest element to handle and control. And so we know of a company in France that is using silicon to store hydrogen, and we just feel like that part of our strategy as a state needs to include, whether it be a publicly available liquid that's recyclable, or at least the research to help in that, so that we can have hydrogen available and not have to carry it in high pressured containers. And really, when you liquefy hydrogen, you lose most of your carbon intensity benefits. It's so energy, it's a user of so much energy to make it into a liquid. So that's one thing we wanted to say. We really feel like CARB needs to focus as one of the mixes of our energy mix for California is the hydrogen that we can get from within our own state, from our own local economies, both the forest communities and the ag communities. Yeah, that's all I have today. I think that we can find win-win solutions, and that economic incentive is the best way to move our economy, and that harnessing the economic possibilities of the free market system, working closely between government regulations and to help direct, but also use the free market power. There will be no faster way to clean up our air and to reduce greenhouse emissions than working with the industries that are already functioning here in the state. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Robert. I'll try and be brief in my responses today. I see we're getting a little long on time, but I just wanted to say that in scenarios that we sought feedback on from you all, which again, we appreciate everybody's comments. That is one of the key questions. It's what should the role of hydrogen be across different energy end uses? How do you source that hydrogen? And what's the role of biomass based feedstocks to be able to potentially source things like hydrogen and RNG, and so we're looking to kind of evaluate that and present some options across the different scenarios. And then I just want to say that we've had a lot of discussion today about modeling the future and creating these scenarios, and then also what the implementation of measures are to be able to actually get to that future. And I think, Robert, you flagged kind of the importance of creating those economic incentives to generate these feedstocks and these energy products. And we have some of that in the state already, right? We have market-based programs that are helping to do that right now. And so that's why we're asking these questions as part of the scoping plan process, is to be able to assess, like, could we use those tools to affect these changes and create those incentives to generate those from that energy. All right, next one.
Okay, next commenter is Nico Bocam. Nico, I'm going to unmute you, and you can unmute yourself and speak.
Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, thank you for the time. Thank you all for putting this together. My name is Nico Bouwkamp. I'm the Technical Program Manager at the California Fuels Partnership. I mostly had a few high-level questions related to the scenario. If I'm understanding it correctly, the scenarios have not been run through the computers and calculated to see what the outcomes potentially could be. But a few questions, mostly based on an understanding or an assumption that these scenarios are really industry cross-cutting. So it's affecting a lot more than transportation and for example, residential or commercial housing, but it goes in many other areas as well, like in industrial applications, etc. I was wondering if there was in the scenarios or in the scenario planning, if there was a variable considered related to how other agencies make decisions, and if that either speeds up or slows down the rollout of or the realistic timelines of these scenarios. So I realize you're using pretty set time targets like 2035 or 2045 for the different scenarios or the rough scenarios that have been presented so far. But it may be interesting to see if there is a parameter or a variable that you can insert that reflects the coordination between agencies with regards to barriers that may exist for assumptions within those scenarios. For example, is it realistic to assume that, and I'm just mentioning some agencies here say that CPUC will accept a lower electricity rate for vehicle charging, and that may have a better effect on the rollout of battery electric vehicles, or is hydrogen allowed to be used for energy storage as well as a transportation fuel at the same time? And these are really relatively random examples, so leave it with that. Don't add any value to that. But I think there should be some consideration of how agency coordination has an effect on the outcomes of the scenario, and mostly about the speed. Then also related to the same topic is probably good to hear if you're also working with these other agencies with regards to how you're going to do these scenarios, what you're going to pick, and what different aspects are. I would assume also that where there is modeling already done in other agencies, that you somehow tie that into the scenarios that you're going to compute. And then the last one, this is more specific, is related to changes of mode of transportation. I think you touched on it a little bit here and there. Vehicle miles traveled kind of touches on that a little bit, but there could also be changes of mode of transportation with regards to the movement of freight and passengers. High-speed rail is an example versus air transportation, or another one is rail versus trucking over, say, like the first 100 miles getting out of the LA region, for example. I'm just throwing that out there. It's not solid feedback, but these are more questions on thinking along the lines of what Mick Skwarla kind of referenced to Michael Skwarla. He said, like, this may be an opportunity to think a little broader and make sure that we're touching on the right items, and the scenarios include the right variables, so the outcomes are as optimal as possible. Thank you.
Hello, this is Rajinder. I can take those questions. The first thing is that, yes, we work with other state agencies. We've been doing joint agency workshops. We do have discussions on how we make sure we're in alignment with what the scoping plan that is available asks us to achieve. And so sometimes it's not perfect, but we do aim and try for alignment so that we're putting the right policy signals, the right regulatory signals and incentive signals to get the outcomes that were defined in the most recent scoping plan. So that work does happen. You're bringing up the point about uncertainty. There can be lots of uncertainty when you move forward. There's uncertainty related to legal challenges, uncertainty that can be related to incentive funding or lack of funding, uncertainty related to permitting and other implementation barriers. And so we do an uncertainty analysis. We don't tease out other agency coordination as part of that, because the scoping plan is big picture. It's not going into very specific implementation of the outcomes. That happens when you actually design the measures to get the outcomes that are called for in the scoping plan. But uncertainty is a big part of the scoping plan in what things could actually support or need to support the outcomes that the scoping plan is calling for. The scoping plan is also updated once, at least every 5 years. So we get to do a check-in to see where we are. For example, in this scoping plan, we will be doing a check-in to see what the progress is towards 2030, the 40% target. And even now, we're already flagging that we know the long permitting times and some of the other issues on the ground are going to delay some of the infrastructure and build out that we need to move clean energy or produce clean energy in the state. And so we do factor that in. We're already seeing that as a potential barrier for this decade, and this decade is critical to overcome those barriers if we want to be on that path to carbon neutrality after 2030. In terms of the uncertainty, it's not just limited to the scenarios that we move forward. There's also scenarios in or uncertainty in what happens if we don't move forward. So for example, in the last scoping plan, we had uncertainty. So we had a business as usual scenario, a reference scenario, which said, what does it look like if we take no action? Well, we didn't anticipate a pandemic. We didn't anticipate looking at a period of economic recovery, a big dip and then a period of recovery. And so this time, even as part of that reference scenario, we're going to be looking at what kind of uncertainty is there on a no intervention future, as well as the intervention future, and those interventions being those scenarios. So those are really good points. They're on the forefront of our minds, and the scoping plan at its core is meant to be an actionable blueprint to help align state actions, whether it's regulations, incentives, or other programs that we're putting in place. Thank you.
Okay, it looks like we're down to our last commenter, and since we're getting close to time, Edward Phillips, I'm going to unmute you and you can make your comment. If you unmute yourself, you should be able to speak.
Okay, sorry, thank you. I was looking for a pop-up window.
So
thank you for allowing us to make comments. Appreciate the workshop. Regardless of what alternatives are ultimately chosen to be included in the scoping plan, CARB staff and its board must first be able to resolve the following 3 issues before selecting a path forward. 1, some technologies are simply not commercially ready for certain uses. Examples of where battery electric and hydrogen fuel cell technologies are not commercially viable today include aircraft, line haul locomotives, ocean-going ships, and interstate trucking, just to name a few. In fact, it will likely take years for those applications to mature, taking us well beyond 2040. CARB staff and its board should therefore remain open to alternative liquid fuels such as renewable diesel and renewable natural gas that achieve many of the GHG reduction goals, instead of relying on a black box to produce mature technology for all applications. 2, any path forward must guarantee the reliability of the fuel supply chain. Energy production, generation, and delivery must remain constant in order to power California's economy, the 5th largest in the world. The risk is too great to fail on this point. California feeds the world, both directly with its supercharged agricultural output and with its goods movement sector that transports 40% of all containers entering the US. Should California's alternative energy fuel supply chain fail, supermarkets across the country would go without food, hospitals without medical supplies, and homes without heating and air conditioning. Because of this immense risk, CARB should ensure that the CEC and private industries can guarantee service reliability before moving forward, instead of relying on hope as a best management practice. And 3, zero emission technologies would likely mature on their own by the end of the century. What CARB is doing with its scoping plan is compressing that time frame. In so doing, CARB is increasing the cost by at least a factor of 3. Private industry and the public sector should not bear these costs alone. Most, if not all, zero emission technologies across the world are taxpayer funded. It should be no different in this case. Grants should remain available throughout the life of the scoping plan to offset the increased cost of this accelerated transition until any increased costs are removed through economies of scale. This is especially true of those sources over which CARB has no authority. Thank you again for the opportunity to provide comments, and I look forward to participating in future workshops.
Thank you for the comments.
Okay, it looks like that concludes our public participation portion. So I'm going to close out the workshop. We encourage you to continue to stay engaged through the update development process. This slide has the link on the Scoping Plan Workshops webpage. Thank you very much for your participation today, and we hope to see you at the next Scoping Plan workshop, and have a good afternoon, everyone. Thank you.